Chapter 11. God's bountiful provision. John chapter 6. How many times do I have to tell you? Have you ever said that? Maybe you were trying to communicate with your spouse or your children. They were preoccupied with their own ideas. You had to speak the same word several times before they heard it. God's children are often like that. We find the story about the feeding of the 5,000 in all four Gospels, Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. It may well be telling that God is trying to tell us something. There was a great crowd, John 6, 1-4. John's account begins with the words, sometime after this, verse 1. These words loosely link the healing of the paralyzed man with the feeding of the 5,000. These two miraculous sign stories belong together. When John crossed to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, he was going from the northwest shore, close to his headquarters in Capernaum, to the eastern shore, where this story takes place. The eastern shore was not a very populated place. We are told that a great crowd followed him, verse 2. Later on in this story, John mentions a number. They were about 5,000 men, verse 10. Even a very conservative estimate would tell us that if there were 5,000 men, there could easily have been 5,000 women and another 5,000 children. We could have a total of 15,000 people in this great crowd, if not more. Why were so many people following Jesus to such a remote area? John informs us that it was because they saw the miraculous signs that he had performed on the sick, verse 2. This strengthens the link being established to the story of the paralyzed man. Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down. When a Jewish rabbi would sit down, it was an indication that he was ready to teach. He was with his disciples. This was their time to learn from their teacher. We have some records of these intimate times. Most of them were just for the disciples themselves. John refers to the fact that the Jewish Passover feast was near, verse 4. He refers to the Passover 3 times in his gospel. The first Passover is mentioned as being near in chapter 2. The second Passover is mentioned as being near in chapter 6, which we are studying. The third Passover is mentioned as being near in chapter 11. Each one of these Passovers took place during a different year in Jesus' ministry. The story which we are studying in this chapter took place during Jesus' second year of ministry, near the time of the Passover. This was significant because as the Passover was coming near, people were preparing to celebrate it. The Passover was preceded by the festival of unleavened bread. The people were thinking about bread. It was a topic of conversation. People were cleaning the leaven out of their homes. Leaven was considered a symbol of sin. Any bread which would be prepared during this time would have to be unleavened bread. There was an expensive need, verses 5-7. Great crowds of people represent great needs. When Jesus saw this great crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip a question. Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat? Verse 5. Buying a small amount of bread would be difficult. This was a remote area. They would have to travel to the nearest bread market. To buy bread for a crowd this large would be almost impossible. John is quick to inform us that Jesus asked this question as a test for Philip. Jesus had everything under control. He already knew what he was going to do, but he wanted Philip to understand the magnitude of the need. Anyone who has been the parent of a bride would understand Philip's concerns. Feeding the wedding guests is a major expense in any wedding celebration. Philip answered Jesus' question by saying, 8 months' wages would not be enough. Let's say that a basic month's wage in current terms would be $3,000. Philip was guessing that it would cost $24,000 to feed this group. Yet, as far as Philip could estimate, the large amount of money would buy not enough bread for each one to have one bite. Verse 7. It would be outrageously expensive to feed this crowd. There was a valid need. People had walked a long way. They were willing to listen to Jesus teach, but they needed something to eat. The disciples needed to try to meet this need. They needed to come up with something. Spiritually speaking, we are in a similar situation. The cost for our forgiveness was extremely expensive. It took the perfect lifeblood of God's own Son to purchase the redemption we needed. There was an inadequate supply. Verses 8 and 9. Andrew spoke up. He was one of Jesus' disciples. We were introduced to him in our study of the Lamb of God. At that time, he was one of the 2 disciples of John the Baptist that had heard about Jesus. As a result, Andrew had stopped following John and started following Jesus. Andrew was Simon Peter's brother. Andrew was the one who introduced Peter to Jesus. Now, Andrew had another person that he wanted to bring to Jesus. He introduced Jesus to a poor boy. We know that he was a poor boy by the kind of lunch he had brought with him. His lunch consisted of 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. He was willing to share his lunch with others, but it seemed to be very inadequate. Andrew asked Jesus a question. How far will they go among so many? The apparent inadequacy of the supply did not seem to bother Jesus. There was a gracious act, verses 10 and 11. Jesus had the people sit down. If they were going to eat together, the crowd needed to get into position. There was plenty of grass for them to sit on. As we mentioned before, there were about 5,000 men. This was not counting women and children. Once this massive crowd was seated on the grass and ready to eat, Jesus began to do his work. Jesus gave thanks for what they had. Remember, they only had 5 loaves and 2 fish. He held the loaves in his hands while he gave thanks. Then he distributed the loaves to those who were seated. Can you imagine this distribution process? We know that there were at least 12 baskets. Maybe Jesus distributed an equal amount of bread into each basket and had the disciples pass it out. As Jesus began to pass out the bread, each person was hoping that there would be enough for himself. Jesus did not have to ration the bread. As the disciples distributed the bread, it multiplied. He gave each of them as much as they wanted. He distributed the fish in the same way. This means he gave thanks again. Then he and his disciples started passing the fish to each group. Again, the fish were multiplied so that everyone received some. They not only received some, but they got as much as they wanted. There was enough for everyone, verses 12 and 13. The people had enough to eat. Then Jesus spoke to his disciples. He told them to gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted, verse 12. Just because there was enough for everyone didn't mean that the leftovers were not valuable. The disciples followed Jesus' instructions. They gathered all the leftovers and filled 12 baskets. There was enough left over for the disciples to have plenty. Another gospel states that the disciples had been the servers. Jesus didn't leave the servers out. He made sure that they had enough too. This was quite a lesson for the crowd. The crowd saw that Jesus included the disciples. The disciples must have been moved about Jesus' care for them. Since they were the servants, they did not assume that they would eat it all. There was a great response, verse 14. When the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus performed, they said something about Jesus. Surely this is the prophet who is come into the world, verse 14. They remembered hearing about this prophecy. Moses had told them that the Lord had made a promise. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among you, their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I commanded him. Deuteronomy 18:18. The people believed that Moses was speaking about the Messiah. The people who had eaten the loaves and fish were saying that they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. The key word in this story is enough. Philip said that 8 months' wages would not be enough to feed this crowd. Jesus distributed bread until everyone had enough to eat. The disciples picked up enough leftovers for each of them to have a full meal. Who did this miraculous sign point towards? The feeding of the 5,000 pointed towards Jesus. Jesus is God's bountiful provision.